Friends, it may not surprise you to learn that over the years, people have asked me over and over again, what is the origin, what's the stimulus for a given Devar Torah? Where do I find stimulation and something that strikes my imagination? And the sources are also obvious. I go to the Torah portion of the week, and I read it and see if anything strikes me at this particular time. I look at the news of the day, what's of moment in our society and our culture. Sometimes other things that I'm reading stimulate my curiosity and imagination. Sometimes it's just a matter of what I'm interested in the moment, something personal or something that emerges from some interactions I've had during the past week. But this Devar Torah, the Devar Torah I'm presenting now, comes from a brand new source, a source that I have never gone to before and never even thought that it might be the source of a Devar Torah. And that was and is this morning's New York Times crossword puzzle. Now, those of you who engage in trying the Times puzzle on a daily basis know that the Friday and Saturday puzzles are nearly impossible to solve unless you are a New York Times puzzle geek. I am not one of those. And therefore, though I try every Friday and every Saturday, I make very, very little headway. This morning, for example, out of 113 clues, I only got for sure 6, with the possibility of getting a couple of more when I go home tonight. But one clue struck my imagination, and that clue was, how many of you did the Times puzzle this morning? Okay. So you'll recognize this clue. This clue was the last thing in Pandora's box. I happen to know the answer to that, and it was one of the 6 that I got. Now, perhaps some of you remember the story, the ancient myth of Pandora's box. It's in fact an origin story about how our world came to be. And here's the story in essence. It seems that when the god Prometheus stormed the heavens and stole fire from the gods for us human beings, the chief god Zeus became enraged at this theft and decided to take vengeance on Prometheus. And as you may remember, Prometheus is tied to a rock, and a crow or an eagle pecks at his liver every single evening until his liver is depleted, and then he starts all over again for eternity. But the vengeance was also wreaked upon human beings because Zeus gave to human beings Pandora. The word Pandora in Greek means all giving, and this is meant very ironically here. Zeus also gave to Pandora a box and charged her not to open it, for the reason that it contains all the many human miseries and evils that human beings might experience were these evils and miseries let out of the box. And of course, as we know, those of us who raise children, that when you tell them not to do something, the first thing they're going to do is to do it. And Pandora opened the box, and this is the reason why we suffer from evils and from miseries. An origin story. Seeing this, Pandora immediately closed the box. And therefore, only one thing remained in that box. And this is the answer to the Times clue this morning. What remained in the box? Hope. And this raises the story's central question. How reasonable is it to have hope? Given the world as it's always been, with all of its miseries and all of its evils, all of its wars, how reasonable is it to have hope? And the myth's answer to this question is ambiguous. On the one hand, since hope is now in the world, in Pandora's box, which is in the world, it seems reasonable that we can hope because hope is here. And so we might be able to have hope to cure many diseases or to end endless wars. On the other hand, hope is still in the box. It is sealed away. It is inaccessible to us. So yes, hope is in the world, but no, hope is not available to us. It is beyond our reach. We may hope for a world without war, but was there ever a time in which there was no war? A great philosopher, Walter Benjamin, said that the history of the world is not the history of many wars. It's the history of one long, uninterrupted war. How rational is it to hope to end war? That hope is in our world may lead to optimism. That hope is inaccessible to us may lead to pessimism. Each can be argued. And in that sense, whether we are optimistic or whether we are pessimistic really depends upon us. Whether we choose to have hope or not. So perhaps you can see that this myth, like so many myths from the ancient world, is really a story for all time. And it's especially a story for our time. So when we look at the current cultural climate, with all its negativity, all its suspiciousness, all of its anger, with liberals and conservatives accusing one another of all kinds of evils, with TV networks erecting and cultivating completely separate and antagonistic barricades against the other, how hopeful can we be that we can solve our problems when rational and purposeful conversation and collaboration has come to such a standstill in our society? So hope is at a premium these days with so many fundamental and seemingly intractable disagreements in our society, with so much heightened anger and emotion defining our disagreements, with the threats of violence hovering over our society. Perhaps the grounds for hope exist, if at all, on the level of individuals, on the level of particular communities. The hope that not only we can live with optimism, but the optimism can spread and become pervasive in our society, though perhaps only one community at a time. At least we might think that we can rebuild optimism for the future on the narrower grounds of community and hope that the hope and the optimism takes root. Now, to this problem, I think I see something of a solution in this week's Torah portion. and in two quite stunning biblical verses. I'm going to read from the end of Leviticus chapter 22. You shall faithfully observe my commandments. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, so that I may be sanctified in the midst of the people. I, the Lord, who sanctify you. The key sentence here is, you shall not profane my holy name, so that I may be sanctified in the midst of the people. I, the Lord, who sanctify you. There are three important ideas in these couple of sentences. First, that the Lord sanctifies us. The second, that the Lord is to be sanctified in the midst of the people. And third, that we are not to profane God's holy name. That is, God has endowed us, God has sanctified us, God has blessed us with many characteristics so that we can choose how to live. This liberates the human spirit. But secondly, that we can, in fact, we must sanctify God. Do you hear the paradox there? That we, mere mortals, can sanctify the cause of all meaning, being, and value, because it's rendered in the passive voice. God is to be sanctified. That means some subject is called upon to sanctify God. God is to be sanctified. And this, I think, the Torah is saying, becomes our vocation as human beings. To sanctify and not to profane, and this is important, God's name. What do we mean by God's name? What does it mean to say somebody has a good name? Our good name carries our reputation. And therefore, not to profane God's name means to protect and preserve God's reputation in the world. How apparently preposterous is this? We are in charge of securing God's reputation. God's reputation, I might say, is good if God's world seems fundamentally hospitable and life-enhancing. God created a good world. God's name is positive. And if God's commandments are fundamentally conducive to a good life. And since, and this is important, God cannot speak for God's own self. What would it be if God parted the clouds and said whatever God would say? God would become a particular being among other particular things. God, by very God's own essence, cannot do that for God's self. And so God's name, God's reputation, depends upon us. What can this mean? Let me give you a couple of analogies. My parents were wonderful people. Some of you knew them, who taught me many important values, both by what they said and by how they behaved. Now, when I treat others fairly, when I speak respectfully to and about others, when I try always to be truthful, I am embracing the values they taught me, and thereby I am honoring them. And whether an observer to how I act has known my parents or not, they certainly could infer that they were great people. And it is by my actions that their reputation is secured. By my actions, I protect their name. Because people might say, how special your parents must have been to have raised 3 fine boys the way they did. Or, as a second example, when I engage in a discussion with others about important ideas or values, if I handle my part of the discussion with intellectual honesty, with a fair consideration of the ideas and values of the people with whom I am engaged in conversation, if I don't insist that my truths are the only truths, when I engage in conversations in this way, I am honoring my teachers who taught me how to engage in a serious conversation with respect for the opinions of others, while also defending, with reason, my own opinions. In other words, the reputations of others, especially parents and teachers, especially if they are not able to defend their own good name, depend on how their children or how their students talk and behave. This is how God is to be sanctified by us. When we live an honest and purposeful life, when we support our sacred communities, when we live lives of values in the presence of others, when we are honest and courageous and temperate, when we strive for justice and for compassion and for the dignity of all of God's children, we are thereby sanctifying God's name, and in the process showing hope for a better society through our intent to honor those who were our parents and our teachers. If only we can live according to the values that are fundamentally humane and life-enhancing, my name shall be sanctified among the people, and we are the potential sanctifiers. And when we enact this sacred task, we are showing that hope is in the world in such a way that we can pursue it with confidence and with optimism. And this is the way in which we can break the fundamental ambiguity of Pandora's box. It is we who can bring hope out of the box and into our lives.